Hello and welcome to And the Runner-Up Is. This week on the show, we're talking the 1963 Best Actress race at the Academy Awards, where Patricia Neal won for her performance in HUD. But why did she beat fellow nominees Leslie Caron, Shirley MacLaine, Rachel Roberts, and Natalie Wood? We'll explore all this and more today on And the Runner-Up Is. Hello and welcome back to And the Runner-Up Is. I'm your host Kevin Jacobson, here to talk about the 36th year of Best Actress at the Oscars, which covered the films of 1963. We'll be discussing why Patricia Neal won, why the losers lost, and who we think was the runner-up of this Best Actress race. And my guest today is, I believe, now jumping to the main show for the first time. He's joined me for a few bonus episodes in the past. He is a true film fanatic and Sporcle curator. Welcome to the show, Christof.
Hello, Kevin. Thank you so much for having me here on the main show for the first time.
Yes, you've graduated to the main show. And I will just also note that I'm sure listeners may know your name often comes up when asking various Twitter questions. So this is the Christof that I mention in those questions.
The Christof, yes.
The Christof. My great friend Christof. Okay, well, before we talk about 1963, let's just talk about Best Actress as a category. So my first question, as always, for you, Christof, what is your favorite Best Actress win of all time?
Well, I thought a bit for a while about this because there are so many great Best Actress winning performances that it's hard to choose between Liz Taylor's second and Kate Hepburn's third and either of Vivian Lee's and Judy Holliday, Maggie Smith, Liza, Holly Hunter, Meryl Streep, and Sophie's Choice. It's hard to pick, but when I took a step back and thought about not what is my favorite Best Actress winning performance, but what is my favorite Best Actress win, so we can factor in a bit more than just the performance itself, but also who is the actress in question.
Right.
At what point in her career did she win? What means this film in her career? Who did she win against? What does this win mean? It's actually a pretty easy answer for me because my personal favorite actress of all time is Anna Magnani. It's either her or Hanna Schygulla, but Hanna Schygulla doesn't have an Oscar and doesn't even have a nomination. So for the purpose of this podcast recording, my favorite actress of all time is Anna Magnani. And while I personally might prefer other performances from her career, like in Bellissima or Mamma Roma, she won still for a great performance that allowed her to show how she can pour everything she has into a role. It's a role that was written for her by a Tennessee Williams. It is beyond her winning. It's also a moment for the Academy when the Academy showed that it's opening itself up to European actresses, even if they had to come to America for the film. And in the year that she won, she was definitely one of the best performances that were nominated. I might on a weekday admit that maybe Katharine Hepburn was doing things that are so special in summertime that she would have been a very great winner as well. But Kate Hepburn has 4 Oscars elsewhere. No one is going to cry about her losing this one, least of all she. So altogether, Anna Magnani winning for The Roast Tattoo is probably my favorite Best Actress win.
I love that answer. It's certainly a unique one. I don't think that's come up as a favorite win thus far in the show. So I love when I get a very specific. Obviously, your fellow German friend Fritz is a big proponent of Louise Reiner. I just like when there's a very specific person that, for whatever reason, a guest really has connected with that is different from what you would normally hear. And yeah, I love that performance. We talked about it. We talked about her obviously in Wild as the Wind as well. Two great performances. Do you have a preference between those two?
Between those two, I'd probably go for probably go for the Rose Tattoo.
Yeah, that's fair. Either way, I think 2 for 2. And yeah, I personally would have picked Katharine Hepburn that year, as I said on that episode. But
I forgive you.
yes, thank you. I appreciate that. We're hashing it out live on the air here. But yes, glad that Anna Magnani had an Oscar and really was able to break through with, non-English language performers in Best Actress. That is now reached its peak with Sophia Loren winning a few years prior to this year that we're going to talk about. So yeah, she was the blueprint, as they say. But my other question for you, of course, what would you say is your most heartbreaking loss in Best Actress?
I might say something controversial now and something that might make you want to question your own judgment in inviting me to the podcast, but
oh my God.
My heart doesn't break over the Oscars.
Wow.
Yes. I'm a cynical old man, and while I love it when the Academy goes right, I tend to shrug it off when, I don't know, Jenna Rowlands doesn't win for A Woman Under the Influence and isn't even nominated for opening night, or when there's a certain writing on the wall throughout the entire award season that Sandra Bullock is going to win it this time, no matter what. So I just accept it when things happen. The closest thing to actual heartbreak I do experience is when there is a real chance of an exciting winner. And when the Academy in the end goes for, let's say, a safe option instead. Right. While watching an awards race, you get the sense that maybe this time the Academy could go outside of their usual wheelhouse. And what I think is just the most recent Best Actor race. Now, I don't mind Jessica Chastain being an Oscar winner, and the performance in The Eyes of Tammy Faye is probably the best of all the biopic options that were on the table last year. However, there was a moment in the race when it felt like Penelope Cruz could actually have a chance to win this for Parallel Mothers, and it seemed like a real possibility. And when, in the end, it was Jessica Chastain rather than Penelope Cruz, it was not really heartbreaking, but just a disappointing moment that the biopic performance that I personally believe will not last as long as a win by Penelope Cruz would have lasted, won in the end. I believe Penelope Cruz in Parallel Mothers is one of those performances that's destined to be one where decades from now, when people look back at this Best Actress race, will say that this is the one that should have won, actually. So my answer, the closest to heartbreak, probably Penelope Cruz.
Wow. That is a really interesting, obviously, interpretation of that. Yeah, I don't disagree with you there. For me, both Penelope Cruz and Olivia Colman in The Lost Daughter kind of towered above all the 3 biopic performances that were nominated last year. And I would definitely have wanted either of them, especially because, as we know, as of late, the Academy does tend to default to some safer choices. Both of those would have been pretty exciting, I think. But here we are. Still glad Jessica Chastain has an Oscar. I do really like her as an actress. But yeah, they definitely defaulted, I think, in that case. But luckily, we have a race, I think, where even if maybe the writing of the time was that Patricia Neal was the front runner, I do think it's a pretty unique type of winner.
Oh, it's certainly a unique winner in a kind of a strange year for the category and for the Academy as a whole.
Yes. Well, I think it's time to break it down. The 36th Academy Awards, the nominees were Leslie Caron in The L-Shaped Room, Shirley MacLaine in Irma la Douce, Patricia Neal in HUD, Rachel Roberts in This Sporting Life, and Natalie Wood in Love with the Proper Stranger, with the winner being Patricia Neal. So, of course, before we break it down individually, Christof, what are your overall thoughts on this lineup?
Well, this is a lineup that's flying very much under the radar because it is lacking, let's say it's lacking an all-time of a performance. I think pretty much every other year in the 1960s had at least one performance that you could see people today rallying behind and praising it. I don't really see one of those here. What we get are 5 good to very good performances in films that some of them are a bit forgotten. There's not a single Best Picture nominee here because the much maligned Best Picture field of 1963 had only one female-led film. I think we might come to this later on Twitter questions why this one isn't here.
Yeah.
So the Academy was forced to look elsewhere for Best Actress nominees. And while arguably not all the films we're going to be talking about are, in fact, female-led, they eventually came up with a quite interesting lineup of, let's say, mostly women of ill repute that are better than I remembered it to be.
Yeah, I came away with a lot of the same feelings as you. For me, this is a very strange lineup, to be honest. It's actually one of the only lineups where, before embarking on this Best Actress journey, I had only ever seen the winner. So 4 of the 5 performances here I straight up had never seen. And I also didn't have that much context for these performances either because, like you said, I feel like they barely get talked about anymore, if at all, unless it's for, these purposes. So it just wasn't really a lineup that I had any expectations for, which is maybe a good thing when you think about it. I went in with an open mind, you could say. But now having watched it, I can say that it's, for me, kind of an underwhelming lineup. I don't think there's a bad performance here, to be clear, but it sort of feels like a lineup of like the actresses who missed out on an Oscar nomination but were in like the 6 to 10 range because either the performances weren't strong enough or the movies they were in weren't strong enough. It just sort of feels like very few of these performances here have really had much impact outside of the year that they were in, which, yeah, I mean, it does make this a pretty unique year. As far as narratives, though, we have Patricia Neal winning here on her first nomination. We have Leslie Caron and Natalie Wood, who, these 2 actresses I think Hollywood probably thought would get Oscars eventually, but getting their final nominations here. We have Shirley MacLaine continuing her sort of hot streak in a film that is tonally very different from the rest of these others. And then you have Rachel Roberts, who I barely even knew much about heading into this week, but I've since learned a lot about and find her to be quite fascinating, actually. So yeah, I do think it is definitely a year where the Academy clearly struggled with the main contenders that were offered to them, and that's why we have kind of a wonky lineup. But I'm ready to break some of these down if you are.
Oh, very much so.
Well, we are starting off with Miss Leslie Caron in The L-Shaped Room. This is the second and final nomination for Leslie Caron, as of this recording at least. Who knows, she may make a sudden career comeback. But we last talked about Ms. Caron on the 1953 episode where we discussed Lily, a real doozy of a time there. And here she is 10 years later doing something very different, much more dramatic, much more realistic, and probably her most adult role that she had played thus far in her career. And this is kind of a role that she actively sought out because she was tired of playing the kinds of gamine, pixie type of ingenue characters that Hollywood was offering her. We should also mention that since Lily, she had starred in a Best Picture winner, Gigi, for which she wasn't even nominated. And this is only 5 years after that, taking a very dramatic role that was definitely seen as a big departure for her. So let's talk about it. The L-Shaped Room, it's a British kitchen sink drama, very much in the mold of the other British dramas that were popular at the time, like Room at the Top, Sons and Lovers. And it's about this young unmarried woman named Jane, played by Leslie, who is pregnant and she wants to have the baby but not really involve the father. So she rents out a room at this shabby boarding house and meets all the other tenants there during her experience, including this guy named Toby, who she gets into a relationship with, and their friend Johnny, who's a trumpet player. And eventually Toby finds out from Johnny that Jane is pregnant with another man's baby, and he freaks out, and it causes a lot of strain in their relationship. So let's talk about Leslie Caron here. Christof, thoughts on Leslie as an actress overall, and what do you think of her here in this sort of dramatic departure for her?
I'm not the greatest fan of Leslie Caron as an actress.
Mm-hmm.
Also, it seems like the Academy might not be the greatest fan of her because she was in An American in Paris Best Picture winner, wasn't nominated.
Right.
Gigi with 9 nominations and wins, wasn't nominated. Fanny, which was also a Best Picture nominee,
Right.
she was also not nominated for that. Instead, she got a very weird nomination for Lily. Here in this film, I know that this is a performance that has some great defenders who actually like her a lot in this. I think she is adequate in this role. That is unusual for her, but overall, I find her to be the weak link in this entire lineup. She has a character that is very passive throughout the entire film, and it's maybe a bit a fault of the film itself that it throws her into a film with a lot of characters that I personally, at least, find a lot more interesting than her, uh, like the trumpet player played by Brock Peters, or the elderly neighbor who used to be an actress, or even the landlady who is in the first scene is testing how much money she can get out of her and is shouting at her when she's confronted about bugs in the mattress, and is a bit testy overall. And Neil, in almost every single scene that Leslie Caron has with another actor, she is the more passive part of the conversation, and it feels more like she is drawn by her scene partner. The only exception that the only scene where I really feel that she is leading here and she is the force that drives us forward is the scene in which she is talking to the baby, to the father of the baby she's carrying, and where they're basically breaking up. That's a really good scene for her. Other than that, I would have hoped to see something a bit more expressive from her, to be a bit more on her side, to get more what she's feeling. But she's often drawn back to herself. That's what comes across to me.
Yeah. I think I maybe like the performance a little more than you do, but yeah, it's a very passive character on the whole. And I will just first of all say that, listeners who've heard that 1953 episode, remember I wasn't the biggest fan of Lily or her performance in it. I do think this is a step up. I won't be bashing this performance like I did with Lily necessarily. I do think it helps that obviously the material is stronger and she is allowed to do more than she was asked to do in probably a lot of her other films prior to this, not just Lily. And she, for me, does prove that she does have some emotional depth to pull off something like this. It's not a performance that I'm head over heels for necessarily. I think she's good in the film in terms of, taking the audience on a journey from someone who doesn't really know much about sort of navigating London and being very much that innocent type that she had been typecast as, to then maturing as a woman and sort of being able to stand up for herself and make her own decisions and be comfortable in those decisions. And there's something very delicate, I think, about Leslie Caron as a screen presence, very refined, very innocent, obviously girlish, and I do think it would be easy for her to just sort of fall back on that and really mug for the camera in a way to get the audience's sympathy just for her situation. But she does, to her credit, I think, take a more grounded approach to where you still do sympathize with her as she starts to fall in love with this guy, but she doesn't know how to really break it to him that she's pregnant and she has every intention of having the baby and everything, but she feels, for me at least, much more like a real person than she did in most of her other films up to that point, which, mostly her work prior to this sort of had a layer of fantasy or like a whimsical aspect to them. Here, I think a lot of that is gone, which I find refreshing personally. She still does have her kind of swoony romantic moments where she's like getting to know Toby and everything, but she is very much an adult woman who's making her own decisions. Maybe that is a part of the reason why this really stuck out and got her this nomination, is how much of a departure it feels like, even though, again, she still has that innocence in the beginning. I think you kind of see her blossoming here a little bit more. Even if, like you're saying, it doesn't really work for you as much, you can still sense that other people would be like, wow, okay, we're seeing you in a new light.
It's certainly very different to anything she made before. And I don't dislike it. I think she does what the role asks of her. Maybe the role doesn't ask as much of her. Maybe she could have even shown more. I don't know. I actually like her moments when she is flirting with Toby and seems genuinely happy, where she's not just this melancholic presence, but actually has a bit more to show, even if it's maybe a bit closer to what she did earlier in her career. But it's the moment in these when she is a bit different from her general mood in the rest of the film, where I'm starting to get actually drawn to the character.
Yeah, I think in the beginning, she doesn't have a lot of money. She sort of negotiates her way to a better price and all of that, all the way through. I think the beginning, weirdly enough, the beginning scenes for me work better for me than the weightier stuff towards the end. There's something clearly at the beginning that's sort of haunting her that she's able to convey, I think, just in her quietness, her reserved quality. And I guess it sort of feels like a kind of performance where it's hard for me to pick out obvious scenes of great acting, but sort of taken as a whole, it kind of works. Sort of like when I was talking about in the 1959 episode, for me, when, Audrey Hepburn in The Nun Story, I think that's kind of a performance where you can look at a clip on Twitter out of context and see, is it a great performance? I don't know. But if you lean in and sort of watch the whole thing and sort of pay attention, I do think a performance like this is more rewarding, if that makes sense.
I understand. Also, when I'm trying to think of maybe individual scenes of her that stand out, the one that comes to my mind, the scene that I personally find most impressive, is the scene after she's taking the pills later in the film and walking through the night, which is a very impressive scene. But I don't really think that she is doing the heavy lifting here. It's more the score and the editing of that scene that makes the entire scene set apart from the more realistic scenes that the film has elsewhere. But this is probably my second favorite scene of the entire film, and best where she's in the center. And that's really one that stands out, even if it might not be exclusively her performance that makes it stand out.
Yeah. I think actually, to speak to that, this is something that may come up a few other times in the course of this episode, where we sort of do have a performance sort of working in concert with the other elements of the film to create a sort of effect. Just to put a pin in it, I do think there's an element to this with Patricia Neal and HUD. Just kind of her presence there is sort of the effect that it has is her, but it's also the film and the broader context of it. And I think that's the case in the scene that you're mentioning there. I also think, to think about an individual scene for her, the scene towards the beginning with the doctor's office and the doctor's being very condescending about how, like, of course she didn't use protection, and he wonders, like, what the father wants to do about the baby. And she makes it clear that, also her parents won't do much to help her. She knows them too well, and she has this sort of certainty with knowing that she doesn't have any choice but to sort of carry it out on her own. And, there is that discussion of an abortion, and the way she sort of pauses to sort of consider it, like she knows this isn't quite the right option for her, and her very firmly sort of stating to him that she wasn't sure going into this appointment if she did want to have this baby, but that she wants to now, I think is interesting. I think you're seeing it all sort of playing out on her face, sort of weighing her options and considering all the alternatives and everything, and sort of resolving to the idea of trying to sort of go it alone and do things on her own terms. So, that's a scene towards the beginning for me that I felt like, okay, she's coming on strong. Like, this is going to be about a woman sort of trying to resolve to go a certain way and sort of forge her own path. in her life. And then to speak to what you were saying earlier, the other characters, sort of populate the screen, and I do definitely become more interested in their stories, especially the Brock Peters character, Johnny. Uh, I find myself wanting to know their stories more than her, where I feel like, she's a good sort of consistent, almost like straight man, kind of like regular person reacting to all of the eccentricities around her. But I sort of start to lose interest in her performance over time.
I mean, it's funny that you call Brock Peters the straight man, because I think his character isn't
He's not the straight
explicitly
man.
said to be gay in the film, but
Yeah.
from the performance, it gets pretty clear that Peters knows the source material where he is gay. And also Maeve, the neighbor, who has the great performance of "Take Me Back to Dear Old Blighty" towards the end of the film at the Christmas scene, which is just a wonderful scene where she's just nervous at the beginning and then really gets into it. So these other tenants at the house are really great and interesting characters, and I really found myself invested in them, and always a bit of a shame that I found myself more invested in them than in Leslie Caron.
Yeah. What do you think of just the relationship here that forms with her and Toby? Because I think they have a nice sort of easy chemistry together, but then of course it reaches a point where he wants to take it to the next level, and she's telling him to not fall in love with her. I think because she knows that it could get complicated once she starts showing the pregnancy, which she's right about. It does get very complicated. What do you think of that relationship?
I think that's quite a good element. It's also interesting when she's breaking up or has the scene with the father of the child, and describes Toby as the boy who lives in the same house and who is in love with me, and is getting out of her way to actually say what she's feeling about Toby, because she doesn't want to make it complicated. Even, well, as you said, with time moving forward, it's gonna get complicated at some point. I think the scenes with Toby are quite good, and probably a bit of the emotional center of the film, at least in terms of her character, and they kind of worked for me.
Yeah. And then, as things go along, they eventually do consummate, which is this very tender sequence, I think, that they both play pretty much with commitment, and I think is pretty racy for 1963.
Yeah.
Just saying. It's in doing this show, it's just been interesting to sort of see what's being more allowed to show in film, going chronologically. It's like, this is a lot more daring than the actress nominees we've seen in the past. But, after that point, we have Toby just wanting nothing to do with her, and she doesn't really know why. I think she plays a kind of confusion of that really well. But eventually it does come out that Johnny, their supposed friend, told Toby that she's pregnant and also that she's a whore. And her reaction to that, I think that's sort of played out with them both talking through the walls, because she's neighbors with Johnny. I think that conversation is pretty moving, I would say.
Yeah, it's nothing that really put me in awe, but it's just it's a good sequence. As I said, it's a very I call it an adequate performance. It makes it sound worse than I actually feel about it. It's a good performance.
She does the job. Yeah.
Yeah, she does what is expected from her, and it works. And she doesn't do a wrong step, even if she may not completely draw me in as much as would like to.
Right. And I'm also curious if you have any thoughts on some of her bigger moments. Like, obviously, there's this moment where she is in that sort of moment of despair and she takes these pills, hoping to, kill the baby, but it doesn't really work out. And after that point, she is back from the hospital and he finally is coming back around, and she gets very frustrated with him for being so cold with him. I'll just say here, I do really like this sort of running theme of the film that she sort of expresses here, that just because she knows more about him or he knows more about her, it doesn't have to change things. And it's
And
all sort of this like pent up emotion that's being released here, which is cathartic for her, cathartic for the audience.
yes, she
Yeah,
finally gets more emotional. It's almost like I've been waiting for her to let it out all out a bit
exactly.
more than she did at that point. So it really was a moment the film maybe has even been building up to some degree. And
Hmm.
when she finally could release what has been building up inside her.
Right. And so that's why I think it is sort of cathartic for the audience to finally have her be able to open up in that way after her character's been just so passive throughout most of the film. And I think as the film sort of reaches the conclusion, we do get this sense that she is going to be okay, that she hasn't really changed all that much sort of dramatically since we first were introduced to this character, but that she's sort of found strength in other people, kind of like in her own chosen family here. And there's a way I think that she carries herself, just sort of her posture, her dignity, that helps to sell the end of the film. I think as she has her baby and she decides to leave this room that she rented and go back to France, there's just more of a sort of self-possession that she has compared to how she entered the film. So I think even though I don't always find this character to be the most interesting person in the film, she does approach the role with some sincerity and honesty, and also does fit in with the kind of kitchen sink realism of the film pretty naturally. She doesn't feel like she sticks out that much. And like I said, she's kind of a good straight person at the center of all of the chaos around her. So it's good. It doesn't blow me away, but better than Lily.
Well, almost anything would have been better than Lily.
So you agree?
Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering your thoughts on that Lily performance as well.
Well, I haven't seen Lily in a long, 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 long time, and I
Mm,
don't really have any urge to revisit it from the very dim memories that I have of it. Oh, I
yeah,
remember that it was a very strange film, and I did not like it.
yeah. Well, your instincts were correct, and you don't have to revisit it, although it is very short. But anyway, do you have anything else on Leslie Caron?
Maybe the one thing I find interesting that she was nominated for Best British Actress in the BAFTAs, even although she's
Mm-hmm.
French,
Yeah,
which is an interesting thing.
yeah. I don't know if like they just count like any European actress in that. It is
I
strange.
think
I would agree.
she had previously been nominated for Best Foreign Actress for some other film.
Wow,
So
look at
maybe
her.
it maybe it depends on the film or on the origin
Yeah,
of the film.
I suppose so. Yeah, that is very interesting. Yeah, I think Leslie Caron, just for her career, I was glad that she was able to get this nomination and that she was able to break out of the sort of, girlish ingenue types of roles that she had done in the past. I think she's very proud of this nomination and this film just from seeing her talks over the years, just like even over the past decade or so, has talked about this film and this performance. So it's clearly one that she is proud of. So good for her that she got this nomination. Let's move on to our next nominee, Miss Shirley MacLaine in Irma la Douce. So this is Shirley MacLaine's third Oscar nomination in 6 years, so a real prime era for Shirley MacLaine. I think she still had a lot of goodwill from her performance in The Apartment. She was excellent the very next year in The Children's Hour, and here she is reuniting with the dream team behind The Apartment, Jack Lemmon and Billy Wilder, and sort of trying to make magic happen again. And there are some interesting tidbits about the making of this film where it was originally conceived as a vehicle for Marilyn Monroe, which also would have been a reunion with Billy Wilder and Jack Lemmon. But she died the previous year and she was replaced by Shirley MacLaine. Also, Irma la Douce was originally a stage musical in France, but Billy Wilder was not interested in doing a musical, so he took out all the songs and turned it into this more farcical comedy, and that's Irma la Douce. So the film tells the story of a French sex worker, Irma, played by Shirley, who meets this guy Nestor, played by Jack Lemmon, who's working as a police officer and cracks down on this local brothel where Irma works. But he's actually suspended from the force after being accidentally bribed by some local criminal types. But after that, he comes back around and visits her again, clearly is falling in love with her. She falls in love with him. But he wants her to give up her life as a sex worker. She doesn't want to, so rather than talk it out with her like a normal person, he decides that the best course of action is to pretend to be a British nobleman named Lord X and pay her a lot of money so that she doesn't need to see other guys. But in order to sort of feed this scheme, he has to go out working at the marketplace, and it's all about him trying to keep up this charade while she is just sort of blissfully ignorant and collecting that cash. So let's talk Shirley MacLaine. Any thoughts on Shirley MacLaine, the enduring Shirley MacLaine, and her performance here in Irma la Douce?
I mean, how could you not love Shirley MacLaine? Shirley MacLaine is one of the great actresses, let's just say one of the great entertainers that we have. And I know that her performance and I know that Irma la Douce are pretty controversial and a lot of people do not like it at all. I really enjoy the film and I really enjoy her in it. Shirley MacLaine is asked to play a very specific kind of character here. She is asked to play the American fantasy of what a Parisian prostitute is. Yeah. Like, she is brash and confident. She has a pimp who is violent to her, but that's not really what defines her, and she can just switch to a new one if the new guy wins against the old guy in a fist fight. She parades around with her cute little poodle on her arm, smoking cigarettes all the time. It's very much a very specific fantasy, a very specific kind of fiction that she's asked to play here. And if you just accept that someone like that never existed and only existed in the fantasies of some screenwriters or writers, there's a lot to enjoy in this film and in this performance in particular. Her character is quite contradictory. I mean, it's hard to know, is she stupid? Is she observant? I mean, she's observant enough to immediately realize when Lord X is wearing his eye patch on the wrong eye, but she doesn't notice the lipstick on Jack Lemmon's cheek until Moustache clumsily tries to rub it off. Also, she has no second thoughts when Lord X just switches the eye patch to the other eye and oh, that's why it all was so foggy here. So it's a very strange character, but somehow her performance is pulling me through because she is hitting these particular kinds of notes for the strange characters so well that I'm not questioning it as I'm watching it. I might be questioning it afterwards, but as I'm watching it, I'm just like seeing her. There's also moments of exuberant joy when she is coming with the 500 francs she got from Lord X the first time, throwing the money all through the tavern and eventually dancing on the billiards table. It's a joyful scene to watch her, and she's a commanding presence in this film, and I really like seeing her.
Well, I obviously love The Apartment. I raved about her performance on that episode. One of my favorites of this decade. Everything in that film, I think, is just perfectly in sync with each other. That is very much not the case for me here in Irma la Douce, which I find to be interminable at 137 minutes. It's the kind of film for me where you try to look for meaning and what the director and what the writer are trying to say with this, what their perspective is, and I just sort of walk away by the end of it feeling like this doesn't mean anything. Like, we're just having fun. That's the vibe. And I don't think every film has to have a message, obviously. But if you're not going to say anything, then at least be funny or entertaining. And this is so hit or miss for me with the comedy that by the end, I was just sort of waiting for it to be over. I really enjoy Jack Lemmon in most of his performances, but he is going so far over the top here in a way that feels like Billy Wilder was just like, Jack, just go bigger, do whatever you want, and he just went for it. But Shirley MacLaine, though, I think she is giving it a decent shot here. I wouldn't even say best shot, because I did read that she wasn't entirely thrilled with the script. She wanted it to be a musical. She wanted more substantial material to work with. And I think the result of that is a performance that is good, but not entirely committed, I would say. I think she's doing what she can to sort of ground the film in some sense of reality, especially in those first few scenes where she's kind of like, you know, conning her clients to get more money out of them, which are played for laughs, you know, but she's so full of personality, and she has that fun, sort of easygoing charm that we love from Shirley MacLaine. She gets a handful of more dramatic scenes throughout the film that she gets to dig her teeth into a little bit, but yeah, this is very far from a performance that I walk away from being like, now that has to be nominated for an Oscar. It's very much like an average Shirley MacLaine performance. Nothing particularly outstanding about it. You know, she gets some laughs. She's having some fun, like you said. It's just sort of fun and easy to watch her. But I feel like I get to the end and I'm like, what am I missing here?
I'm not even sure that there's a point of missing something here. I mean, it's just,
Yeah.
it is, in the essence, it is a light movie. And well, she's basically asked to carry the film, while on the other hand, Jack Lemmon gets the red carpet rolled out to do just about every goofy thing you could imagine. I mean, Jack Lemmon is my favorite male actor of all time. And even I might admit it maybe is a bit over the top, but overall I still enjoy watching him in this, because Billy Wilder said, okay, Jack, do whatever you want to do.
Right.
And she has to ground the film by playing this character who's really strange in herself. And she's basically the thing that, in my eyes, ensures that the film doesn't completely fly off and is just complete silliness to watch. She has those moments that I really like. Even by the end, I mean, as you said, I also agree the film is way too long, and I just wonder, this is the version without the music numbers. If it would have music numbers, this would be, I don't know, 3.5-hour film.
We would need an intermission.
Unless you find some things to cut out, and maybe you would be able to find some things to cut out.
I would.
I would assume that would be Jack Lemmon scenes, because also by let's say by the final act of the film, by the last act of the film, we lose her a bit as a main character, because it's really more and more about Jack Lemmon, and she is just appearing intermittently, so we don't forget that she's there. But she's setting the tone early in the film. I mean, in the beginning we have this wordless transaction between her and John, where she has the doggy in hand and smoking a cigarette, and then he's following her to the room, and then we see her tell a series of different stories to different clients, how she ended up being a sex worker, and every story leads to the client paying her more than she asked for, was the accepted price, because she just finds the tear-jerking story to get this sympathy. And it's the moment like these that I really become fond of her performance and the way she's playing this.
Yeah, I completely agree. Those beginning scenes I found to be very promising. I mean, it's just like Leslie Caron all over again, where I feel like the most interesting stuff is towards the beginning for me, where it feels like, yes, she is very much the lead of this film, and this is going to be about her and her ability to sort of get one over on these guys. And that's why, for me, it's frustrating by the end, where it feels like she has been got by the Jack Lemmon character so much. And there's never a point in the end where she sort of is like getting one over on him by the end. And it feels so uneven for me that I just got frustrated. Like, once we get into the sort of crux of what this film is going to be at about, I guess, the midway point or something like that. I don't know if it's exactly midway, but when he starts to do the Lord X scheme, I was wondering if there was going to be a point where she would finally just catch on, but even if she did catch on, maybe kind of continue going through the motions with it to sort of keep up this charade and whatnot and keep getting this money. It's sort of like the guardsman, you know, with Lunt and Fontaine, like that sort of dynamic. Like they both know what the other is doing on some level, and they're just kind of doing it to sort of test each other. And then that's not what this is at all, because like their first conversation together, their first meeting, after he leaves, after giving her the money, she's like, yay, I got this money and I got this great new client. And there's not really any attempt to like realize that she's being conned, even though she is someone who cons people all the time. So it's very like, I don't understand what we're doing here.
I mean, it's also part of this thing about her character that you simply have to accept as given when there's this conversation between her and the Jack Lemmon character early in the film, when Lemmon proposes that he's just getting a job so she can stop being a sex worker, and she says almost that she has to carry him through because it's what would the other sex workers say about her if her man would have to work. So this part of this Parisian prostitute fantasy that the entire film is grounded on, and which probably is also part of the reason many people just do not like this setup as a whole, because you have to buy into this fantasy. And yeah, it's a strange character dynamic, but somehow I'm still drawn to it, and she is a big part of that, why I'm so drawn to it.
She is the main part of why she still kind of comes out of it unscathed for me. But to speak to that, actually just thinking about, there is a scene where she talks about, you know, wearing makeup when she was 14 so that she could look 17. And I don't know, is maybe sort of hinting that she's been involved in this line of work since she was 14. I don't know if that's exactly what's being said there, but it seems like maybe.
It feels like this is very much implied, yes.
Yeah, which he doesn't want to hear about it. But she's clearly fallen for him, and she wants to work for him since she's actually interested in him as opposed to that other pimp. And I think for as troubling as that development is, it is in keeping with what she tells us of her background and how her mother was also in this line of work and how she's been doing this for so long, and how really like the only kind of relationship that she knows does have that transactional element to it. So of course her way of expressing her love is wanting to work, quote unquote, for the Nestor character and sort of make him into her pimp in a sense. So that does track with the character, and I think she sort of plays that sense that, you know, I've been doing this for so long. There is kind of just like this routine way that she goes about life that I think is very lived in, and like she sort of inhabits the role better than I maybe was even expecting going into it. So I like that aspect of it, that like she's been doing this for so long and she's so stuck in her own routine that this is just the way things are, and is very matter of fact about it. So I like that part of her performance, at least.
Yeah, and ultimately it's a farcical comedy, and you can only go so deep with a character if this is the material you're working with, and if this is what the material you're working is actually aiming to do.
Right. I mean, things do take a turn eventually when he is forced to work to keep up this whole charade. So he's up all night and, you know, sneaking back into the apartment, and she's like showing off this dress for him, but he is fallen asleep, so she starts to become annoyed with him, and she thinks he might be off having an affair. Again, I do just sort of get frustrated with this because I honestly think my problem is that Shirley MacLaine just has a sensibility to her that is smarter than this character. Like, she does a fine job with it, but there are moments here where the kind of farcical comedy of it just feels a little beneath her, I guess, or just not really something that she can naturally inhabit, this type of character who is not that smart at the end of the day. I don't know. It's just like not really giving her enough to do by the end, like you were saying, outside of just reacting to all of his bullshit, basically. I mean, she finally does confront him at one moment where he comes home late, and spits in his face, which is a great moment. She has this line where she's like, he thinks he's numero uno when she's numero uno. Ask anybody. Which I think her delivery on that really does sort of cut through all of the bullshit. But then, of course, he slaps her, which is rough. And I just feel like by the end, I don't know, are we supposed to be rooting for this relationship? Because it feels like she should like absolutely get away from this man by any means possible. But she just keeps getting further and further in love with him.
For some reason, yes. Also, I think it's interesting. 3 of the 5 characters we're talking about today are unmarried women who are or get pregnant in the course of the film. And the only one who actually is married to the unborn child's father by the end of the film is the literal sex worker.
That's true. Interesting. So I don't know if that says anything, but it is an interesting observation.
And I think we didn't even mention that she gets pregnant by him. In the course of the film. I just realized that.
That's true. That does happen.
Because it's in that part of the film where she's the supporting character, and we'll learn that she is pregnant not because she is telling Jack Lemmon, but because someone else is telling Jack Lemmon.
Of course. Because apparently this is his story, even though the film is called Irma la Douce. Anyway, things just sort of escalate from there, where she wants to run off with Lord X and everything. So he decides to kill off the character and dump his clothes in the Seine. But then it looks like he's killed Lord X because of that, so he's arrested for murder. Classic farcical comedy development there. And she's obviously distraught by this until she realizes that Nestor did all of this out of love for her, which, you know, her reaction to that is just so elated and everything. And I don't know. She's doing her best with the material, but it's just too contrived for me to really connect in any sort of, you know, meaningful way. And obviously I can appreciate a good sort of comedic performance, but the film is just not as funny as I think it thinks it is, and she's not really given many moments by the end to really shine. I can appreciate that she's serving something very different compared to the rest of these nominees here, which are much more dramatic, but I just walk away feeling like, yeah, it's a good Shirley MacLaine performance, and that's it. Like, I don't feel like this needs to be recognized on this level, and it feels like a performance that would only really be recognized in a very weak year, to be quite honest.
A good Shirley MacLaine performance is something you can always recognize, and
Right, sure.
I will admit that this is a year that is a lot weaker than other things. We will probably have a look at alternative performance that might have been nominated later on this episode. I actually like the fact that sometimes even a comedic performance, or even a performance from the film that is just so farcical and ultimately silly, makes it through. If it has to take maybe a week, a year for a performance like this to get through, so be it. But I don't mind at all that this is an Oscar-nominated performance.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I want to be happy when a performance like this is nominated that is more broadly comedic, because it doesn't happen often enough, especially in modern times, I will say. But for me, this just doesn't really feel like it needs to be recognized, I guess, for me. I don't know why. I think it's just the material itself I don't really connect with as much. So I'm just like, yeah, she's the best part of her movie, but that's kind of where it ends for me. Happy for her, love her, but there are other films of hers that I would gladly watch again over this one. So, anything else on Shirley MacLaine?
I think we can move on to our next nominee.
All right. Well, we won't be talking about Shirley MacLaine for another, 14 years. The Turning Point is her next nomination, so it'll be a while, but she'll be back before we know it. Let's move on to our next losing nominee. We have Rachel Roberts in This Sporting Life. So this is our only one and done nominee of this lineup, but she did have a solid career. Rachel Roberts, she was born in Wales. She was very acclaimed in Britain. She won a BAFTA for Best Actress for her performance in Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, which came out in 1960. And it was very much a sort of British new wave style of film, much like This Sporting Life. So I think she was very much specializing in this kind of gritty realism style of film and acting at this time. She was also married to Rex Harrison starting in 1962, so right when this was being filmed, and their relationship eventually dissolved, and she found it hard to be married to him, the public pressure of it all, and she battled alcoholism and depression. So, even with the success that she had with awards and with finding these great roles, she had a hard life. And I think it's important to talk about that and sort of establish that when we talk about this performance in This Sporting Life, which is also quite raw and powerful and feels like it's coming from a deep place from her. So the film, it's about this coal miner named Frank, played by Richard Harris, who is recruited to join a rugby team and is sort of celebrated for his rough and tumble approach to the game. Meanwhile, he gets into a relationship with his landlady, Mrs. Hammond, played by Rachel Roberts, who is cold and distant and older than him, but he finds himself drawn to her anyway, even as she tries to push him away. And eventually their relationship does progress to the point of a real relationship, but she is just sort of haunted by the death of her husband and is hesitant to really take things further with Frank, even as he tries to force himself on her and sort of struggle to express how much that he loves her. So let's talk Rachel Roberts. We've got another British kitchen sink drama here. Thoughts on Rachel Roberts, if you had any overall thoughts on her as an actress, and what do you think of her here in this film?
Rachel Roberts is a fantastic actress, and I'm glad that the Academy found a role to nominate her in This Sporting Life, even if This Sporting Life is not exactly about her character, because this film clearly belongs to Richard Harris. She becomes more of an important character. I mean, she's arguably just a supporting character in this film, at least in the first half of the film. She becomes more of a central character and more of a lead in the second half of the film, I would say. Mm-hmm. And she has also an interesting arc where she is this woman who tries to keep the Richard Harris character away, who tries to shield her feelings away and almost forces herself to harden to her, and who is very much living with thoughts about her dead husband, and at one point even says she can't let her feelings go again, and that she is almost trying to protect herself from feeling the same thing that she was forced to go through when her husband died or committed suicide or died in a way that was later ruled as suicide by others. So it's quite a touching story, and it's a very good film that it is in. And even if her story arc is not the main focus of the film, it's still present enough that it's really one that I find fascinating to watch.
Yes, me too. This, for me, honestly, was one of the bigger out-of-nowhere surprises doing this series so far. I, to be completely honest, did not have much of a relationship with Rachel Roberts before watching this film. I'd seen some of her later work. I've seen Murder on the Orient Express. Obviously, I'd seen Picnic at Hanging Rock. Thought she was, good in both of those, but not so good that I was like, I have to see everything this woman's ever done. So I was pretty open to anything with this. I had heard she wasn't necessarily a lead here. I knew it was about, a rugby player, so I was like, is she just the girlfriend wife role that gets in because she's like the sympathetic type of what if there was a wife type of performance I've talked about in the past. But I have to say, she really kind of blew me away here. This is such a fascinating, enigmatic kind of performance, and one that really does feel like it's coming from a dark place within her. It's a much more compelling character than I ever expected, and what I would expect from a film like this, to be honest. Her first scene, she has this fierce kind of severe look to her where, he's telling her that she should charge more rent, and she's very prideful and cold and pushes him away, and he's sort of insistent on how she looks unhappy, and he's trying his best to sort of cheer her up and whatnot, but she insists right back to him that she doesn't want him to live there anymore and that they'd be better off without him. And even though that's such a simple scene, just establishing the dynamic there, I feel like you get everything you need to know about this character just in how she plays out this whole scene on her face, like her reserved quality, her coldness, her distance. It's the kind of person that you wouldn't want to approach on the street, maybe because of just how standoffish she is. But at the same time, if you were to actually, look at them and really have a conversation with them, there's like this fascinating kind of draw that they have. And that's how I feel about Rachel Roberts here. And it's obviously so key to the story that Frank could just sort of have any woman he wants. He's a successful rugby player, good looking guy. Why is he drawn to this woman who is cold and bitter and is always like pushing him away? But you see, I think, even through that bitterness on the surface, that there is someone underneath that who is very capable of love and warmth. But it's like she has this armor that she puts on, and she just has that indescribable sort of draw, I think, where she's so down to earth and naturalistic that she feels like a real human and real, like, flawed person who is dealing with a lot of pain. Kind of like, I almost relate it to what Piper Laurie is doing in The Hustler in that respect, and is sort of trying to process everything, but can't help but show that sort of darkness inside of her on her face and in her sort of body language and everything. So I think it is a very studied kind of performance, but not in a bad way. I think she really is committing to this character more than what is on the page for her.
Yeah, I mean, you see that this character is a woman who has been hurt very bad in the past. Mm-hmm. And the way Rachel Roberts communicates with stares and with glances, where you almost feel afraid of her, just from one look that she can give, and one look where she communicates that a line has been overstepped. This is really quite intense from her. There's also a scene early in the film where she's kneeling in front of the fireplace, and Richard Harris is asking her about her husband, and she monologues quite wistfully about him, and there's a lot of emotion in her voice, and we don't see her face at all. The face is away from the camera. We just see the back of her head. And then at the end of the monologue, she turns around, looks at Richard Harris and at the camera, and her voice and her tone completely change as she turns and just says, "I shouldn't be telling you this, should I?" Mm-hmm. And you feel her hardening in the moment and really just trying to remind herself not to get emotional around this man who is trying to woo her and who is trying to charm her and is trying to establish a relationship with her, because she is keeping him away by a deliberate decision.
Yeah. And the fact that she can't look at him as she's describing this, I think, says a lot about her character. Yes. So, yeah, that whole sequence, I can see it so vividly in my mind as you're describing it, because it is so evocative when she's talking about how her husband was saying things like, "Why was I ever made alive?" There are those hints there that he was very troubled, but she can't quite admit maybe that was leading up to his death by suicide. It reminds me a little bit also of like a Katharine Hepburn in Suddenly Last Summer almost, where there is like this secret shame in a way over how this person that she loved more than anything died and the manner in which he died. And she is just kind of stuck in that past place in a way and isn't really willing to commit to exactly what it is that really happened. Or if she does know, she can't express that even in words. So she just has like this kind of cloud of darkness over her that is just really fascinating to watch, and I don't think was necessarily, like, if another actress had taken on this part, I don't know if they would have the very X Factor kind of quality that Rachel Roberts has in this role. It feels like someone who really understands this character inside and out, and is actually kind of the type of person and her disposition and everything that isn't seen as much in mainstream films. So That's part of why I really connected with this performance. There's also this sort of cautiousness that she has with them becoming closer in their relationship, and how she's very nervous about what the neighbors might think and everything. You know, there's a moment where he comes around in that really nice car, and she's sort of softening a little bit there when she sees this grand gesture that he's made, but is still very much on the lookout for whether people are watching, you know. And after that, they go out on their drive, taking the kids, because she has kids. I didn't mention that earlier. She has kids with them, and they stop, and he's like playing catch with her children and being really almost fatherly with them. And she's sort of like scoping out the entire situation, like not really sure of his intentions or how she's even feeling about the situation. She's kind of watching from a distance and seeing how he's interacting with them and how she feels about it. I like that sequence as well.
I mean, yes, these scenes where you see her slowly accepting that this man is caring for her, and also accepting she's caring for this man. These thoughts about what others are thinking about her and about them, probably more about her than about them together.
Yeah.
There's also a scene when he's gifting her a fur coat, and she initially smiles at the present. And then she glances at, I don't know if it's a housekeeper or a neighbor who's with them, she glances at her several times, and it becomes evident she becomes uncomfortable, and the thought is on her mind what she might be thinking about her getting this expensive gift from this man. Also, when they are out in a restaurant, and his incredibly boorish manners embarrass her so much, and she's leaving the restaurant telling him that he's acting like a pig, where he couldn't embarrass her more if he really tried. These are the scenes where you see that she's deeply hurt because of the way others think about her, which probably even goes back to the death of her husband, where she maybe sees herself confronted with, do the other people think that I drove him to suicide? It's these thoughts, what others might think about her and about her relationship with men, that are really an important driving factor for her actions and her behavior in the entire film.
Right. And that's kind of the theme for her that doesn't need to be there, quote unquote, for what the overall story is trying to say about this sort of, you know, rough and tumble rugby player who doesn't know how to express himself in his personal life as well as he can on the field. You know, they don't have to sort of foreground her feelings on everything as much as they do, but they do, and she really commits to it. And I love that scene at the restaurant of him just treating everyone like trash, and it's her look of being so mortified. It's a smaller moment for her compared to what he's doing, which is very big and loud, but it's very in keeping with this character who mostly is keeping to herself and carries herself with a certain kind of pride and dignity. And after that, you know, they go to a wedding, and it's very apparent on her face that she wants out of this relationship. And to give credit to the film, I think there is that build-up that we've been talking about, where he takes her out with his fancy car, he gets her this fur coat, he acts a certain way, and he doesn't seem to really have much regard for her own feelings on any of this, on anything really, and she's just had enough. She feels like there's like an expiration date on this relationship, and that's that. You know, another film might not be able to accurately convey why she would reach that breaking point, with very subtly like leaving the breadcrumbs to where she would feel like, you know what, I'm done. You know, another film might feel like, why is she saying that? This is sort of coming out of nowhere. But she makes it work, and the film puts in the work to make you believe that. And personally, I think to be on her side. So for me, I definitely feel a lot more sympathy to her than I do to him, who I think Richard Harris is also really excellent in this film, but is obviously like this boorish kind of guy who doesn't know what he's doing in his personal life half the time. But it's a good two-hander, you know?
It's a great two-hander. I really like this film a lot. As you say, Richard Harris is great. You also mentioned he looks great in the film. Cough, cough. And it's...
He's doing like a Marlon Brando Streetcar type of performance here.
Yeah. The structure of the film is a bit odd because, let's say unusual, because basically the first half or so of the film is told in flashback because it begins with him being injured playing rugby, and he's getting anesthetized in a dentist's chair because he apparently lost some teeth. And then the entire backstory of him and Rachel Roberts' character is told in flashback as he is anesthetized in the chair, which is unusual, but it kind of works for the film because it also helps with jumping forward a lot and makes for some quite economic storytelling.
Yeah, and it reflects him, I think, within the text of the film. It feels like him sort of reflecting on his life up to that point. These major moments in this relationship and everything. So, I mean, after all of this, she's just, again, done with it, and they have another argument scene towards the end, and the way she just attacks that, back and forth between the two of them is really powerful, saying, we don't need you, that not only do I not need you, but my kids don't need you either. And he finally accuses her of essentially driving her husband to suicide, which is this really big heightened moment, and it really stings. You really feel that, and she fights right back. She's yelling at him to get out. It's this really intense scene, visceral, like kitchen sink drama at its finest. But again, it's both of them really matching each other in intensity. You almost want to give them like some kind of joint award for both really informing each other's performances and working so well with each other, even though they're doing such different things. So it ends very strong, I think. And it's unfortunate to see where the final notes of the film go, ultimately, which is, I would argue, again, very similar to Piper Laurie in The Hustler in terms of that particular arc. But I was really just so drawn in by everything she was doing in this performance that every time they would cut away to him sort of dealing with all the sort of men in his life who are trying to manipulate him into certain situations, or even like the wife of the manager trying to seduce him and whatnot, I found myself really wanting to go back to whatever she was doing, personally speaking. So, but yeah, even still, to go back to what you were saying, over the course of the film, it feels like it becomes more of a leading performance than it does in the beginning. And that's why I feel like if there's a discussion about, like, is this category fraud? I kind of don't think it is.
I think it's the kind of performance where you could argue both categories and you could make fair points for both. So I think neither is fraud. It's just you could place it here and you could place it there and you could find good arguments for both. I'm fine with it being in the lead category.
Yeah.
And actually, in the course of this conversation, I almost got convinced. I probably would have put her in supporting, but in the course of this conversation and more thinking about it, I kind of got convinced that she really belongs in lead, and that I should really move her there for myself as well.
Wow. Well, yeah, I think that was my own journey with watching the film. Like, okay, this is just clearly she's the female lead of the film because there's not a lot of women in the film, and therefore she's being placed in lead. But then over the course of the film, it really feels like this really epic sort of two-hander between these two people that, again, her needs and her wants are foregrounded more than I ever expected. And so by the end, it feels like a co-lead. She is not the lead. She is not the number one lead, but I do think she is a co-lead, certainly more than the winner that we'll talk about later on, per se. But maybe we'll have that conversation too and change our minds there. Who knows?
Feels unlikely.
Yeah, well, we'll see. Either way, I think this is a performance that I urge people to check out, and a film that I urge people to check out. As a film, it's doing very interesting, dark things and playing with film structure, as you mentioned earlier, that Yeah, it's really fascinating. As of right now, it is on the Criterion channel, just to let people know. So I would urge people to check that one out. Anything else on Rachel Roberts?
Maybe one more thing.
Okay.
Our friend Fritz, my friend, your listener Fritz,
My
made
listener.
made a series of video essays on all the 1963 Best Lead Actress nominees. You should really check out all of them, but if you have time for only one of them, watch the one on Rachel Roberts, because it's heartbreaking to hear her entire story laid out, and also this performance talked about in the context of her career as a whole.
Yeah, I agree. I've watched all of those for the record, and I can't recommend them enough. They go much further in depth than we did, and I think we went pretty far in depth. But I do think, to speak to what I was sort of mentioning in the beginning, when you look at this performance taken with her personal struggles before and after this film and her own feeling like of inadequacy, I think that makes this performance even more special and heartbreaking on its own. So, yes, definitely go watch that, though, that series from Fritz. My good friend Fritz, not my listener Fritz. Sorry about that past error. But yes. Shall we move on to Natalie Wood?
Let's move on to Natalie Wood.
All right. In Love with the Proper Stranger. This is Natalie Wood's third and final nomination, and it's definitely her continuing to seek out interesting adult parts after a successful career as a child star. And I think she really showed people what she was capable of, obviously, with Splendor in the Grass. And here she's not playing a teenager, she's not playing a high schooler, she's playing a full-grown adult. And she's playing a woman named Angie, who comes from an Italian-American family, and she reunites with a guy that she had a one-night stand with, played by Steve McQueen, who doesn't recall her very much at first, but she tells him that she's pregnant, and they take steps to have an abortion, but she backs out of it, and the rest of the film is about the two of them sort of connecting on a deeper level and falling in love with each other. So yes, this is Natalie Wood's final Oscar nomination, although I'm sure it would surprise voters at the time to know that this would ultimately be her last and that she would never get an Oscar. And keeping in mind she was only 25 at this time, so she was still very young and getting these nominations in pretty quick succession. So what do we think of Miss Natalie Wood and her final nomination here?
I mean, we love Natalie Wood. Who doesn't?
And there's some people, the Harvard Lampoon, for example. More on that later.
This film, this nomination, this film is another quite odd one, which has a bit of a problem juggling its tone and getting its tone correct, or trying different tones throughout the entire film, because there are parts of it that make it feel like it could belong into the kitchen sink drama genre. Like there's a very grim abortion or near abortion scene. Other parts are romantic comedy and feel like they belong to a romantic comedy or family comedy genre. And Natalie Wood manages to play every scene, I would say, as it should be. And if there's a bit of a problem to connect it as a whole, it's more a problem of the film trying to go different things and different kinds of genres during its runtime, and trying to tackle its subject in different kinds of ways that maybe don't always match and don't always look like one perfect whole. But she certainly does what is required from her, and I really like the way she's playing it, because her performance feels kind of fresh to me, fresh and almost modern to me. I really liked seeing her throughout the entire film.
Yeah, I think Natalie Wood is pretty good here. I think she was obviously, one of the more gifted, committed young stars of the time. You can see her really pushing herself further with each role now that she's an adult. And even though it might not look like it on the surface, I do think this is a challenging role for her, in the sense that she's having to carry this film through all of these shifting tones, and be this convincing Italian American woman, which Natalie Wood was not Italian. She has to sort of be expressive in that way, but not so over the top that it comes across as like an offensive Italian stereotype,
You mean like the rest of her family in the film?
Like the rest of her family, yes. The people she's surrounded with are really hamming it up. But yeah, she's kind of having to find depth and kind of a soul in this character that does get her moments in the script, but sometimes I think just the overall story feels like it's all a little predetermined, I guess, in trying to get these two characters together more than anything to do with her own personal journey, how she feels about the idea of having a baby and everything. But there's a lot more to it than you might think, and I think she does a pretty good job with it. I don't think this is a knockout performance, but she does what she can with it. Actually, in some ways, it feels like Natalie Wood sort of walked so that Cher and Moonstruck could run. That's very much the vibe I'm getting from the sort of traditional Italian family scenes and the idea of this sort of central character trying to make her way through dating and relationships. And we're also in New York. I think Cher probably does, for me, a more convincing job than Natalie Wood does. I think she does a decent enough job with the material, especially in the first half of the film, which is more dramatic in the tone. It is very oddly shaped, though, as a narrative, because I think normally with a film like this, it would sort of start off as a kind of cute, comedic sort of thing, and then become more dramatic as the story gets deeper. But this sort of feels like the opposite.
Yeah, right. I mean, the more heavy scenes are really at the front, and the lighter scenes are at the back. I must admit, when I was rewatching this film, I had forgotten that Natalie Wood is supposed to be Italian American, and it really only registered for me when she was in her family, surrounded by all those Italian American cliches. And I'm kind of glad that she didn't really try to go Italian American at all, I would almost say. Which I think this would have probably been rather harmful to the performance as a whole. She is tackling it with more of a fresh energy. For some reason, I had pictured the performance as sort of like Aubrey Plaza, maybe. I somehow was reminded of her. I cannot tell why. It's this energy that comes with her, or maybe a few of the looks that she gave. But she really has this energy and this freshness going through her that especially is very good in the lighter scenes, but she also more than holds her own in the dramatic scenes, whether it's at the beginning when she's confronting Steve McQueen, saying that she's pregnant with his child, even after realizing that he pretty much has no memories of her at all. And then in this abortion scene that comes later, she is really good in all those scenes, even although I certainly prefer her in the more lighter moments where she is really having a great energy going through.
I wouldn't disagree there. I feel like just the setup of the film at the beginning is more dramatic and weighty, and I was sort of preparing myself for Natalie Wood to give like this powerful performance about this woman who doesn't know what she wants, whether she wants to have this baby, whether she ever wants to see this guy again, like how is she gonna break free from her very oppressive family. But then it feels like it just becomes more simplified as it goes on, in a way, just narrative wise, not her performance, and it just sort of centralizes on this idea of, hey, how are we going to get these two crazy kids together? And a lot of the nuance, I think, is just not really there by the end. And try as she might, I don't know if Natalie Wood really is given enough to bring it home by the end and have a super satisfying arc. I'm not sure if she's to blame for that or if it's just the script's fault for going in that very basic direction with it. And let's say this is a story that they wanted to tell, that it is just this love story where the one night stand turns into a serious relationship. Like, that's fine. But if you want to do that, I think at least give me something more compelling and fun and sort of punchy, rather than, we get like a handful of conversations about how hard it is to be in love these days, but not really scratching the surface beyond that. So I think material wise, she is not quite given enough compared to what she's capable of. But to speak to what you're saying as well, she makes the most of those lighter sort of rom-com Moonstruck feeling scenes. She makes the most of those and really is surprisingly natural and modern, and she has a little bit of like Italian expressiveness with her hands at least, but yes, is not necessarily going like, the spicy meatball kind of a thing.
Yeah, and she also, I think she has very good chemistry with Steve McQueen. This is not the kind of character that Steve McQueen is known for playing, or that he would play much more often in his career. So it's interesting to see him just as a romantic lead, without car chases or action scenes or anything. And she works very well together with him. And then we later see her also coupled with another boring guy that her family would love her to be together with. This is very well into the comedic part of the film, where she fakes laughing at his bad jokes and fakes being interested in her future sister-in-law's story, and then finally just spills the drink over trust to get away from the table. She has really found very great moments to play this with these scenes. But when then Steve McQueen comes back, you clearly get to see that for the purpose of this film and for watching that, we want these two to get together. And even although they had a falling out earlier where her character didn't really react all that well when Steve McQueen said he's partly responsible for this mess, and just answered, "And I'm the mess," and gets angry. So the way she and Steve McQueen worked together was kind of surprising, mostly because it's not what you expect from McQueen.
That's very true. I think this was his first sort of testing the waters of, can I do different genres? Like, appealing to more female fans, to speak very broadly about it, was sort of the studio sense that I got from what I understand. But yeah, he proves himself pretty well here. I really like the scene where she meets his parents, which is a very charming scene where the parents are like trying to give him money, and they're very welcoming of her, which you can see her sort of gently start to soften a bit. But then all of that is interrupted by her brothers, who are like chasing them around, and they sneak into this place and hide out and get to know each other. I really enjoy that whole sequence where she talks about how, the whole idea of love is so built up in the movies to this sort of unrealistic standard. And it's sort of like almost what I was saying with The Apartment back in that episode, the idea of being like a modern woman and sort of the weight of expectations and like pressure of society and everything really taking its toll. And then him talking of sort of his own unluckiness in love. And it's this kind of sexual tension point that's just really flowing really naturally between both of them. And I love her whole disposition in this scene, because she is mature even compared to how we see her in Splendor in the Grass, which is only 2 years earlier. She is just, as a person, more hardened, more cynical about love, you could say. Like when she turns off that song on the radio and she's like, is that what love is? But she still has a kind of youthful feeling to her, and still a little bit of that sense of like drama to her, like that age where you feel like you've figured out life, but you're only like 22. I know that feeling very well anyway. She captures that specific sort of crossing point of, you're an adult now, but you're still young. You have a certain feelings about how love is portrayed and how that compares to, how things really are. I like that whole sequence and how they are gradually connecting with each other, but she can't really allow herself to say that, even if she's saying it all in her eyes, which incredible eye acting. Natalie Wood, one of the best.
Oh, yes. I also like there's a certain energy. Her brothers, who are much older than she is and are going much more for the Italian stereotypes. She still has a good energy with them, that you believe that this is an energy between siblings. There's this line early in the film where, even although I don't completely understand the context or what it actually means. Just alignment of Columbo, Columzy, which I'm just obsessed with because it's seeing them interact is just it's very charming.
Yeah, she has big little sister energy. Let's just say that.
Yes.
And she also has an energy that's like, I am surrounded by men and boys in my family, you know.
Oh,
so
yes.
For some of her later scenes, like when the Rocky character, Steve McQueen's character, goes off and arranges with her brothers basically to marry her, and he comes back and he's saying like he's willing to marry her, but not really giving the sense that he actually loves her necessarily, which angers her, and she sort of lashes out at him, and she's like, I don't want to be a ward. Like, she doesn't want to have an unhappy household, and this whole idea of like, I will just marry you so that we can have this sort of nuclear family, but the foundation of the relationship wouldn't necessarily be on really like a genuine feeling of love, more so than just like obligation, right? I think that aspect of it plays well for her, where it feels earned, because look at her own household and how unhappy she was in that household. So I think it's like she's this woman who's sort of trying to forge her own path. And I really related to and understood, and I feel like she understood that part of her character of like wanting to break free from all of the expectations, not only of society, but of her family.
Yeah, and of wanting to hear the bells and the banjos, as she would say later in the film.
Right.
Which probably would have worked better if this motif of the bells and the banjos would have started a bit earlier of her maybe saying it. I mean, I think she only says it in the last scene, and then just the next scene we see him with the bells and the banjos. So, but that's not her fault. It's more a thing of screenwriting.
Yeah. I mean, just again, tonally wise, it feels like there was one director for the first half of the film and then someone else took over for the second half. That's kind of how it feels to me, and was just like, you know what, I'm going to go in my own direction with this. I don't want to make like a kitchen sink drama. I just want a rom-com. But yeah, by the end, it's, she decides to move out and get together with that guy, like you're saying, that her brothers were setting her up with. But eventually she does meet with Rocky again and tries to present herself in sort of like this sexy, sort of alluring way when he goes to meet her at her place, and they find themselves attracted to each other again, and they kiss, but then he insults her and wants to try to have sex with her again, but she pulls away, and he's kind of asking if she's been sleeping around, essentially, which angers her again, and she throws him out. The tone is sort of all over the place by this point, but I do just find her presence to be very watchable and grounded and just really fun. Again, it feels like it's paving the way for a lot of other romantic comedy types of films a little bit. Obviously with Moonstruck, I also think of like My Big Fat Greek Wedding, like that's kind of the vibe of just like this young woman who has this overbearing family and wants to do her own thing, and it's just kind of cute and light by the end compared to maybe what I was expecting in the beginning, but she at least gets to showcase her range in that respect. So I'm fine with this nomination.
Yeah. Do we talk about the abortion scene, or do we pretend it doesn't exist like the rest of the film does?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely treated it like that sequence is treated, in the sense that it's sort of done away with very quickly and never really referenced again. Yeah, how do you feel about that scene, which is obviously a bigger scene for her in terms of expressing?
That's truly a grim scene from another film, where she's led into a bare room, and this woman just says, "Come on, get undressed," and it's very cold and very unsanitary, and she is just standing there scared stiff until after what feels like forever, Rocky breaks down the door and says, "It was nothing like we said. You should be a doctor," and they finally just leave it because they do not want to have the abortion under these circumstances,
right?
Which is quite a grim scene, which belongs into another film. Even the scenes before that are not quite that realistic and serious in tone.
Yeah, which is like, it feels like it belongs in the L-shaped room,
Yes.
or even This Sporting Life. Not necessarily this film that in the end is just like a big happy ending kind of thing. It's just, not a particular fan of just the tonal inconsistencies here, but she did what she could with it, and yes. I commend her for it. It's unfortunate for me that this is the last time that we get to talk about her here on the main show, because this is her last nomination, but honestly, huge kudos to her just for being able to get 3 Oscar nominations by the age of 25. Like, she's done more with her life at that point than I have, so what can I say?
Most of us.
Shall we move on to the big winner?
Let's do that.
All right. Patricia Neal in HUD. Patricia Neal, another first-time nominee, winning on her first nomination. And I have to say, the parallels with the previous year are really fascinating to me, because we have a first-time nominee winning over mostly people who've been nominated before, someone who had won a Tony previously, and a case like The Miracle Worker also, where it's nominated for a whole bunch of Oscars, wins a supporting award and wins Best Actress, but isn't even nominated for Best Picture. Plus, Patricia Neal was in the original cast of The Miracle Worker on the stage with Anne Bancroft, so kind of wild. I also, just as an aside, kind of think that Anne Bancroft and Patricia Neal are of like a similar type casting-wise. But regardless, Patricia Neal was indeed a stage actress, a film actress. She'd done a number of films in the 50s and 60s, like The Day the Earth Stood Still, A Face in the Crowd, Breakfast at Tiffany's. So she was on the radar, at least. She seemed decently well respected. She worked with the Actors Studio, so she was definitely part of that crowd. And then she gets this part in HUD and wins the Oscar. So HUD is about a guy named HUD, played by Paul Newman, who lives by his own rules and is often getting into these conflicts with his father, played by Melvyn Douglas, who is much more principled and conservative. And we also have this sort of parallel story with HUD's nephew, Lonnie, who Brendan DeWilde, who we last referenced back in the 52 episode with the member of the wedding, as some may recall. Here he is all grown up. And then we have Alma, their housekeeper, played by Patricia Neal, who kind of flirts off and on with HUD until one day he takes it too far and tries to take advantage of her. So let's talk HUD and Patricia Neal. Do you have thoughts on Patricia Neal as an actress? And what do you think of her here in this leading actress win? Emphasis on leading.
Yeah, leading, less than 22 minutes of screen time. And Melvyn Douglas, who wins Best Supporting Actor for this film, has almost twice as much screen time as she has.
Yep.
I think, at least by the current standards that we have, there's very little doubt that this is not a lead role, but very much a supporting performance. It's a very good supporting performance, but her character is not the one the film deems most important, second most important, or even third most important, I would say. She is the housekeeper of these 3 generations of men. She has a sassy persona. She has obviously been with the family for quite some time. There's a lot of familiarity with them. There are tensions, flirtations, different levels of flirtations with the Paul Newman character, with HUD, and with Lonnie, the Brandon DeWilde character. You can see her holding her own. You also see her guarding herself. She's certainly very fascinated with the Paul Newman character, but knows that he's one she must keep at arm's length. I liked her a lot in this film. She's not nearly in enough to really justify the lead placement. And even when the most pivotal scene for her comes, when she is almost being raped, the film doesn't seem to be really interested in her perspective at that moment at all. It's much more interested in Lonnie, the Brandon DeWilde character, for who this is a pivotal scene, as this is the first time he is taking a stand against HUD. So while she is really good, this is by no means a lead performance for me.
I would agree. To speak to just Patricia Neal, I like her a lot in a lot of the films I've seen her in. Not to spoil a future episode, but I think she's great. And The Subject Was Roses, which we'll talk about later this season. You know, she's a standout in those earlier films I mentioned before. There's this sort of lived-in feeling that I get from her in a lot of her films, but there's also a sort of theater-trained quality to her at the same time, where she's really good with dialogue and sort of infusing her lines with meaning. And I think she brings that to great effect here in HUD, which is not in any way, shape, or form a leading performance. So I will also agree with you there. But this, I do think, is one of the probably prime examples that I can think of how there are no small parts, only small actors. You know, Patricia Neal just makes the most of every single scene of her very limited screen time in this film, and really just sort of creates this entire history of a woman who the film is not all that interested in compared to the other three main characters here. But I do think she has an understanding of who this woman is, how she got to be where she is, why she behaves the way that she behaves, and why she responds to all of these men in her life the way that she does. And what I love is that even though she's having to bring a lot to a small part, it doesn't feel like she's overstepping and sort of turning it into a kind of hammy performance so that she'll be more noticed. She's just sort of natural and raw, and she's been through some bad times in her life, and her current existence isn't all that great, but she doesn't make it into like a pity party. You feel for her, but you don't feel bad for her. And you also, I think, don't necessarily see her as some kind of like overly flirty sort of temptress type that maybe another actress might do and trying to like figure out how to play this character, you know?
More on the contrary. I mean, there are flirtations, but these flirtations go out from HUD and from Lonnie. And I think it's kind of telling how differently she treats those flirtations. With HUD, you see that she is interested in this man herself, but she knows this type of man and probably was married to this type of man in the past. So she enjoys the act of flirting with him, but she flirts with him in a way that she makes aware to him that she does not want to get serious and does not want to go any further with him. Whereas on the other hand, Lonnie's flirtations, she obviously doesn't take seriously and reacts to them in an affectionate and almost motherly way. And I think Brandon Wild was 21, but I'm fairly certain Lonnie is supposed to be still a teenager in the story of this film. So this is also a different kind, more of a fantasy flirtation coming from Lonnie when he's flirting with her, whereas HUD means it very seriously.
Yeah, you're right there. I think, again, like another actress might play both flirtatious kinds of scenes the same general way, but she understands not only her character, but how her character would react to the people in her life very specifically. And I think it's coming from a place, much like with Rachel Roberts, of great understanding about life, because she had certainly been through a lot of turmoil in her own life, Patricia Neal, that we can mention here. I think it also maybe plays into our discussion of part of why she won, but she had to deal with, you know, the death of her 7-year-old daughter, the fact that one of her other sons was struck by a taxi cab and on the baby carriage and had to deal with sort of brain damage and whatnot. And she had just been through a lot also with a relationship with Gary Cooper that went sour. And it's just, you feel like this woman has really lived a life, you know? And I think she's bringing a lot of that weariness to this part. The problem is there are these long stretches of the film where she is just not in it at all. And there's very little of her material that even figures into the main plot of the film, which is, you know, it's this kind of generational divide between these three men. And if I'm being totally honest here, I don't know if she has that sort of undeniable quality to her where I want to go back to her storyline necessarily. I think she's great when she gets the chance to shine, and I respect what she's doing. And I think she's an indelible part of what makes the film a classic. But it's not a performance for me that transcends beyond her just doing a great job with a limited part, if you know what I'm saying.
Yeah. Also, I mean, all the four main actors of this film are doing a great job in their way.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's not like we're bored with Paul Newman and think, oh, I can't wait for Patricia Neal to come back.
Right.
So these four are a great ensemble, who are all understanding their own characters very well, and so she is not standing out because everyone is on this high level as she is.
Right. Give it the SAG Ensemble Award.
Yes.
Yeah, I respect this win, and I'm glad that she has an Oscar. I just think there isn't quite enough for me here to count this as one of the all-time great Best Actress wins, you know? And you could say, like, well, that's not her fault that she has limited screen time, which is true, you know, but when we look at performances and we look at films in general, everything is sort of working in concert with each other. They're all informing each other. So when the screen time is this limited, or even like in other cases when just like the material isn't strong, like to bring it back to what we said earlier, Jessica Chastain in The Eyes of Tammy Faye, I think is a good example of that, where I think, you know, she's very good in that film, which in and of itself is not a very good film. So it's hard for me to get too excited about her winning, you know? And in the case of Patricia Neal, I think she's wonderful here, but it's kind of like there's a line there where I can only appreciate it up to a certain point. Like, compared to even anyone else here, she obviously has the least amount of screen time. But it almost feels like we accidentally are talking about a supporting performance and trying to compare it to everyone else who's so much a part of their film.
Yes. I mean, she has a few big scenes. Emphasis is on few.
Mm-hmm.
Like her final scene when she is keeping herself from crying while saying goodbye to Lonnie, but then can't help herself. And while she has no intention to see Hud again, he sees her by accident, gives her this asshole kind of non-apology, like, usually I don't have to get rough. And she says to him, you look pretty good without your shirt on, which is true, even although we don't see it in this film.
Yeah.
So she sort of tries to, again, it's no longer in a really flirtatious way. It's in a way that she's clearly communicating whatever was between the two of us can no longer be this relationship. And then she's leaving, not really saying goodbye, and he's not really saying goodbye either, and saying you're the one that got away. So it's this ending is also, you just see she gets all the nuances exactly right, but
yeah,
it's not what is powering this film.
Right. I think that's also my issue, is that what's powering the film is that sort of generational divide between these men. And she's just kind of, actually, to reference something that Fritz was saying in his video, which I watched the other day, it's sort of like she's kind of operating in her own orbit, in a sense, where she's just like living out her life, and it doesn't always really inform everyone else, but she's just like existing on her own plane. But she does, I mean, like, the scenes that she does get, she makes the most of. Like, earlier on when he comes around and she talks about her ex-husband, you know, who was only ever good for whenever she had an itch on her back that she couldn't scratch, something like that. And they have this kind of playful flirting that, again, feels like her just sort of having some fun, but that there's a clear boundary there, that, you know, the flirting is the fun. It doesn't have to go beyond that. Same thing when she's tending to Lonnie and he says, like, she's so beautiful and everything. She sort of takes the compliment, but it ends there, you know, and she makes these men feel good, but not to the extent where they can take advantage of her, which is why when Hud does take advantage of her, there is that line that has been crossed and she has no other option but to leave the situation entirely.
Yeah. And the film doesn't even show us her decision making. We see the scene in which Hud almost rapes her and Lonnie comes to her help. And then we follow Lonnie and Hud. And the next time we see her, her bags are packed and she's already made the decision to leave. So this also shows that her story is entirely secondary to the entire film, because the film is much more interested in what this moment made to the relationship between Hud and Lonnie than what this moment made to her.
Yeah, which is unfortunate, and part of why I think the impact isn't as felt compared to other characters and their own journeys. But she does make the most of, her final few sequences of telling Lonnie that, you'll get along just fine. Just there's a meaning to that line delivery that I find very impactful. She seems kind of close to breaking down a little bit in that moment. You feel like there might be some tears coming underneath all of that. And she just kind of squashes it and tells him not to be lazy. That's a really powerful scene, And then to go back to what you were saying with her final conversation with Hud and saying he looked good without his shirt off, there's still a little bit of that sort of spunk left in her. And it's this really beautiful sort of bittersweet exchange that we leave her on. And she's just gonna go about her life doing something else entirely. And it speaks to why it's so strange to be talking about her in this context of lead actress, because it just doesn't, it's not her story. It's just not. She's her own thing. This version of this story does not center her. I could see a version of this story that does, and her really pulling off a really extremely powerful performance if we were able to fill in some of the blanks of what we might be picturing when she's off screen. But that's not what this story is.
Yeah, that's a shame.
I mean, I think that she's really great in this role, and she gives as much as she can to it. And I also, just to mention something kind of superficial, I think her Southern accent is very much on pitch. Her sensibility feels very much like I am this Southern woman, been around the block, and has dealt with a lot of shitty men in my life. And I'm just like, I'm a survivor. Like, that's the sort of thesis statement of this character, I think, is she's just gonna survive and she's gonna adapt and do what she can to protect herself. That all comes through, I think. So it's just a matter of screen time at the end of the day that's preventing me from really hailing this as an all-time great type of performance.
Yeah.
But shall we talk about why she won this award?
Let's.
Just to get a lay of the land with the precursors, she did win the BAFTA for Best Foreign Actress. She won the National Board of Review, and she won the New York Film Critics Award. She was a Golden Globe nominee for Best Supporting Actress, but all those others were as a lead. Leslie Caron had won the BAFTA from the previous year because it came out the previous year in Britain. She won the Golden Globe, so that she had that. She was the only other person who got votes at the New York Film Critics Awards for Best Actress. And then for the others, we had Rachel Roberts winning the BAFTA for Best British Actress. She was a Golden Globe nominee. Natalie Wood was a Golden Globe nominee. And Shirley MacLaine, without much competition from these others, obviously won the Golden Globe for Best Comedy or Musical Actress. So everyone had something. None of these performances really came out of nowhere to get a nomination. But to get into part of Patricia Neal and why she won this, in addition to the merits of the performance, she did have to deal with all those personal traumas that I mentioned before. She had apparently almost suffered a nervous breakdown after her dealing with Gary Cooper. It was very well known that she had dealt with a lot of personal turmoil, but she wasn't able to go to the Oscars because she was pregnant again and didn't want to risk traveling. I will also just note here that we had a few gossip columnists like Hedda Hopper who were not exactly pleased with the state of the leading actresses at this time, the performances. Not necessarily because of the performances, but because of just the content, which for Hedda Hopper mentioned that she thought it was a little too salacious, too risque. So there was a kind of weird feeling in the air, I think, about just the overall field, like these kinds of, women who were getting pregnant out of wedlock and everything. And I think that sort of weird feeling in the air maybe is what contributed to why we have such a unique winner here in Patricia Neal. But having said all that, Christof, why do you think Patricia Neal was ultimately able to defeat the odds here with the least amount of screen time and win this Oscar?
I mean, these are huge odds you have to overcome to have this little screen time. I think it certainly helped her that she was probably in the most popular film. At least her film had the most nominations out of all them here, even if it didn't get a Best Picture nomination. But ultimately, I do believe that lacking a clear frontrunner and lacking a clear performance that maybe everyone would throw themselves behind, I think people who are just saying her tragic personal backstory gained her a lot of sympathy votes probably weren't all that wrong, because it really feels like sympathy votes might have helped her, in addition to the fact that it is, as we've mentioned, a really very good performance, even although it's not a lead performance, that you could give her a sympathy vote and not feel like you're giving the vote to someone who isn't deserving of the win. She was a known quantity. She had already worked before. So I don't think it was I could imagine that there were several of these who got a lot of votes. So maybe you didn't need to get a huge share of the vote to have more than anyone else. I think these are the main factors that contributed to the win.
Yeah, I think it's, she had a strong personal narrative. She was already, first of all, also a Tony winner by this point. So she was somewhat established. She had the film that they liked the most, clearly, very evidently. I still do not understand how it didn't get a Best Picture nomination after all that love, but she, I do think, much like Anne Bancroft, is probably playing the most sympathetic type of character here, generally speaking. And if you want to say that the Hedda Hoppers of the world, that there was some of that within the Academy membership, I can see them feeling like at least we have, a Patricia Neal here who's just like an honest, hardworking woman as a character and is just trying to do her best in this world full of men. And there's something more sympathetic to her character compared to the others, perhaps.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're probably right that a lot of these others maybe did get votes. Leslie Caron certainly had a strong shot, I would imagine. She does have the most, she has the strongest presence, I would say, in her film. Obviously, again, we talked about how it's a passive character, but we never really leave her very much throughout the film compared to what we get with some of these others, which are very much co-lead situations. Yeah. So I think she had a shot. I do think Rachel Roberts had a shot as well. I think Natalie Wood had a lot on her side as well. Shirley MacLaine, maybe not as much. I don't know, possibly, but just maybe in terms of apple in a barrel of oranges. Like, this is a broadly comedic performance in a field that is very heavy and dramatic. Also, Goodwill from The Apartment, her third nomination in 6 years. I think, generally speaking, it felt like it could have gone to any of them, but that it sort of solidified with Patricia Neal heading into the Oscars because of all her wins, because of her personal tragedies, because of just her ability to get this lead nomination at all, I think proves that voters felt that she had a stronger presence in the film than the film was actually giving to her. Sort of like I guess, Anthony Hopkins in The Silence of the Lambs sort of thing. Like, they make a strong enough impression that they become a lead even though they're not. So,
yeah, although I would say even Anthony Hopkins in Silence of the Lambs or Louise Fletcher in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest is a similar example, are such clear antagonists that it's easier to accept them as leads because they are much more important for driving the story forward. So that sets them a bit apart from Patricia Neal here.
Yeah, that is a fair point. And I think, heading into award season, they had every intention of campaigning her in supporting. She got the Golden Globe nomination in supporting, but from what I understand, the New York film critics were really instrumental in casting her as a leading actress and sort of having her campaign that way because they didn't have supporting actress at that time. So that was their only option, to reward an actress. And that kind of got the ball rolling with National Board of Review and BAFTA and everything. Plus, again, to speak to the overall vibe at the time, I guess people just weren't all that excited about a lot of the lead actress options this year. And so they just kind of defaulted to one that is a clear supporting, but made a strong enough impression that she got into lead. So perhaps we'll explore more of that as we get into our Twitter questions, shall we?
Yes, let's have a look at them.
All right. Well, we're starting off with Joey Gentili, who said, "Why is this the single worst lineup of all time in the category? Actually, as an Academy year as a whole, why is this the worst year of all time? No, that wasn't a question to debate."
Well, that's an interesting question coming from someone whose own Oscar podcast started with the year 1970.
True. Yes. Since Joey has said it's not up for debate, then that's that. But I think there's a reason that there isn't a performance here outside of Patricia Neal, I guess, just because she did win, that people still talk about or reference. I just think these movies are not exactly rewatched very much these days, so I think even if it's not the worst of all time, it feels like one of those Best Actress lineups that doesn't exist.
Although most of the films are forgotten. Well,
yeah.
Hud isn't forgotten, and This Sporting Life definitely doesn't deserve to be forgotten. The other films up for debate, even although I love Irma la Douce. I think there's no bad performance here, so this is why I wouldn't call it the worst lineup of all time, because I don't dislike any of these performances, not even Leslie Caron. What it lacks is a clear standout. What it lacks is a clear all-timer of a performance that you can easily cheer on. So this is the main problem this lineup has.
Yeah, I think it's not necessarily the worst, but just like the most average. Like, it's just very a flat line for me. Not like I'm offended by these performances, the fact that they were nominated. So sometimes, I don't know, maybe that means that's even worse than if it's boring, then it's worse than if it's bad, that kind of thing. But either way, I don't think it's quite the worst. I will probably figure out what that is by the time this Best Actress journey is over. But, I get why Joey would say that.
Yeah.
Wyatt Renfro said, "Do you think that Patricia Neal was category fraud?"
I don't think category fraud is a good term here. I mean, fraud implies that you're getting an unfair advantage over your fellow competitors. And so I would never say it's category fraud when a supporting performance campaigns a lead, because they are only giving themselves an unfair disadvantage for the lack of lead time. She is in the wrong category. She deserves in supporting, but I wouldn't say it's fraud to campaign a supporting performance and lead.
We had that exact argument in the 1946 episode, I believe, with Joyce Ang, where we were sort of differentiating that if you're going from lead to supporting, yes, I can understand calling that category fraud, but supporting to lead does not feel like fraud. It just feels like
shooting yourself in the foot.
It feels like category gambling, really.
Yeah.
Like you're just like giving it a shot in lead and seeing what happens. So that's what I would call it. Or category hubris, maybe. Like you think you deserve a leading win. I don't know. But either way, yes, she's in the wrong category. Let's go to our friend Fritz, who said, "Be completely, totally honest, and no matter what you think of Pat Neal's performance, which is great, do you think she could have won Best Actress without the sympathy for her?"
I don't really think so. I think the sympathy wasn't the only factor in the win, but if you take that part away, I don't really think there would have been much of an urgency to reward her for this supporting performance.
That's fair. Oddly enough, I do still think she could have won, even regardless of that, just because I think they really just liked HUD and they respected this performance in general. I feel like she still could have, but that maybe it was enough, the sympathy for her, to sway the votes in her favor if it was a close race. And then Fritz also said, could Patricia Neal have won in any other year of the 60s?
It feels unlikely because having a relatively weak field was probably the most important factor in Patricia Neal having a chance to win with this performance. And for most other years, I don't really see her pulling through. In most other years, she probably would struggle to get nominated for it.
Mm-hmm. I think this was probably the only year of the 60s that she could have won with this lineup in particular. So yeah, she lucked out in that respect. Lila said, what were the main reasons, in your opinion, that made the Academy consider Patricia Neal a lead despite the limited screen time? So again, we mentioned this. I think it started with the New York Film Critics giving her that Best Actress award, and then there was like that domino effect of every other group giving her lead nominations and wins. And again, I think it's also just a lack of enthusiasm for the lead actress performances that year. So,
well, also I believe it was a question of being submitted in lead because it was in the same year when Roddy McDowall was by mistake submitted for lead in for Cleopatra, and when the studio was informed that the Academy would not accept him as a lead nominee, it was too late to submit him for supporting. There was something like this in Inside Oscar. So apparently by that time, the rules were that the studio submits a performance in lead or supporting. So it must have been the studio's decision to campaign her as a lead. And then the Academy itself, accepted this category placement, maybe with the New York Film Critics giving her the award for actress was a factor in the Academy accepting that, but it wasn't really the membership at large that decided she's a lead.
Yeah, that was a question that I had of whether that was, possible, because like in today's Academy, they can go lead or supporting. Like we see random things like Lakeith Stanfield showing up and supporting for Judas and the Black Messiah, even though he's very much the lead of that movie. Like, you can vote for either category, basically, for actors. I was wondering if that was still the case back then. But, yeah, I guess it was sort of studio submits them, and that is the only place they can be. Sammy Flowers said, Patricia Neal's character was black in the novel and was changed for the film for stupid, antiquated reasons. If the studio were actually to have retained the character's race, are there any actresses you have in mind that would have been a good fit for the role? This is something we didn't talk about in the context of the film, but yes, she is playing a character who is black in the original novel.
I thought about this for a while. My first thought was Diahann Carroll, but I think Diahann Carroll was in her late 20s when Hud was made, so probably she would have been a bit too young. So my alternate answer would probably be Pearl Bailey, who I could perfectly see in this role.
That would have been lovely to see that, yeah. I mean, I thought of Dorothy Dandridge, who was in her 40s around that time, previous nominee. Ruby Dee is another one, I think, who was just coming off of A Raisin in the Sun. Maybe Eartha Kitt, just for fun. Love to see that.
It would have been quite a different performance, though.
Yeah, but I would like to see it.
Yeah.
So, in other words, there were options, but they went in the direction that they went in, unfortunately. Ronnie Castle said, if Neal went supporting, who could have been nominated in her place?
Well, the obvious missing person in this lead actress lineup is probably Elizabeth Taylor, because Cleopatra got quite a bunch of nominations, including Best Picture, especially considering Elizabeth Taylor by this point is an Oscar winner with several nominations under her belt, and Cleopatra is all about her, and she is leading this massive film. You would expect her to pull through in year as this, so maybe she would have gone in instead.
It's hard to say. I think, the easiest way to look at this for me is just to see what was in the Golden Globes list, really. Audrey Hepburn and Charade would have loved to have seen that. I don't know how realistic that was. Geraldine Page for Toys in the Attic, who was hot at the time. I guess probably Elizabeth Taylor, though, was probably because of the strength of the film and the strength of Elizabeth Taylor.
I mean, the question is who could have been, but not who should have been. There is one.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, Audrey Hepburn would have been great. My personal favorite Best Actress performance of 1963 is one that would never ever have been on the Academy's radar, but which I absolutely would have loved to seen. I mean, Margaret Rutherford won an Oscar that year for supporting actress in the VIPs, and it was in the middle of her run playing Miss Marple in a bunch of wonderful Miss Marple movies. And in 1963, the one that was eligible at the Oscars was Murder at the Gallops, where she's dancing the twist and where she's in full horse riding gear and where it's just a fantastic performance. It's a sentimental favorite of mine, but she is absolutely winning as Miss Marple. This would never have happened, but just the thought of this tittle-tattling busybody that Margaret Rutherford's Miss Marple is in this lineup would be an absolute dream of mine. This would be the perfect nomination, and actually she would be my personal Best Actress winner of the year.
Wow. I have not seen that, but I feel like I should check it out now because that sounds fun.
I mean, there are four films with her as Miss Marple. She is completely unlike the Miss Marple that Agatha Christie imagined, because she is eccentric. She is pulling all eyes on her. Murder at the Gallops, the second one, it's the best of them. All four are great, but it's fantastic.
Very good. Let's get to this question from Baby Clyde, who said, Leslie Caron does not have an honorary Oscar. Discuss.
Is it mean to say that I don't really think she needs to have an honorary Oscar?
Yes, it is mean.
Okay, Leslie, Madame Caron, if you're listening to this, I'm sorry.
Which, of course, she is.
I have no doubt.
Fan. Well, there it is, folks. I mean, I think it's a shame. I know Baby Clyde's been beating the drum for Leslie Caron to get an honorary Oscar. And it's fair because they've been giving these honorary awards to people who are still working very actively in film. And you have these older stars who still haven't really gotten their due. So I get it. You know, her work as a dancer, as this sort of charming leading lady of the 50s and 60s is enough that I wouldn't mind her getting an honorary Oscar. She's not my number one choice necessarily, but yeah, I would not be mad at it. Sorry if that's not fully passionate as Baby Clyde may have wanted, but
I wouldn't be mad at it either, but I think they're probably, let's say she is not the first or second person on my mind who really should be awarded with an honorary. Sorry, Baby Clyde.
Yes.
And sorry, Madame Caron.
Some more Fritz questions here. Fritz said, should Irma la Douce have been a musical?
Well, I would love to see the musical version. Let's say it like that. I would hope it wouldn't be 3.5 hours long, but it feels like something that would be a great musical.
Sure, yeah, I would have preferred it, to be honest. I think if it was a musical, it would be easier to take some of the silliness of the film, for me personally. Another one from Fritz. Rex Harrison and Rachel Roberts were both nominated. Who gave the better performance? I don't know if I mentioned that they were married at the time. So we have a married couple getting lead nominations.
I mean, it's not even a contest.
Yeah.
It's obviously Rachel.
It's Rachel, and it's not even close. Even though Rachel Roberts herself said that Rex Harrison gave the better performance, she's wrong.
Yeah.
It's her.
Definitely.
And Fritz also asked, do you prefer the male or female star of HUD and this sporting life? I almost said this supporting life. Wow. That was a Freudian slip there. I mean, I prefer Paul Newman in HUD, to be honest, and I prefer Rachel Roberts in This Sporting Life.
I prefer Paul Newman in HUD. It's very close in This Sporting Life, but I would probably go for Richard Harris.
All right. Christof said, only men. Moving on.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. I get it. They obviously have significantly more to do in their films, so I get it.
I just made a passionate speech for Margaret Rutherford, so there's at least one woman I've been very passionate about.
Yeah, that's fair. Chels said, rank your Natalie Wood Oscar nominations. Did she deserve any other nominations as well? Do you have a ranking of the three?
Well, Rebel Without a Cause has always held a very special place in my heart, and all the three leads of the film are doing something special here, so I would have to put Rebel Without a Cause on number one. I haven't seen Splendor in the Grass in quite some time, so I not feeling really confident about ranking it. I liked Love with a Proper Stranger a lot, so I would probably put Love with a Proper Stranger in second and Splendor in the Grass tentatively third, but with the possibility to go up on second on a rewatch.
I have a very different ranking. My number one is actually Splendor in the Grass. I was really blown away by that performance from her. Very committed. Number two, I do have Rebel Without a Cause, which is close, but she just has slightly less to do than in Splendor of the Grass. And number three is Love with a Proper Stranger. Three great performances. I'm not mad at her getting any of those nominations. So at least she has a pretty decent track record. But does she have any other deserving performances that she should have been nominated for?
I don't really think there are any coming to my mind. I mean, when I look at her filmography after that, she was in a few films that had some attention by the Oscars. Inside Daisy Clover is a bad film. The Great Race is not an acting vehicle by any standard. I haven't seen This Property is Condemned. So the only one that's left is probably Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice, where maybe Diane Cannon stole a bit the spotlight from her. Mm-hmm. So I think I'm fine with it being those three.
Yeah.
There's no egregious snub that's staring at me.
I would agree. Yeah, Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice would probably come the closest, though, yeah. Fritz said, Natalie was also named Worst Actress by the Harvard Lampoon. What do you think of that? What do I think of that? I think it's rude.
It's very rude, especially I've been looking into this. Apparently she has been given the award for Worst Actress of last year, this year, and the next.
Oh my God. What did she do to them? Honestly.
The reasoning was she typifies the worst in Hollywood glamour and non-acting, and that should not go unrecognized.
Oh my God.
I do not agree with that. Apparently, I mean, it's a similar thing about the Razzies. The Razzies are a weird organization that doesn't deserve all the attention it is getting, and it's mainly driven by people who, until this day, hate Kristen Stewart because she was in Twilight, even though they never watched Twilight. So it's just people following their impulses and doing things that they believe are popular with the crowd that are looking at them. And I don't know much more about this Harvard Lampoon. I mean, I read she actually went there and accepted it in person, and which was apparently enough to shut them down with their hating them. So
she was a good sport about it. Yeah.
Yes.
Kind of like, Halle Berry accepting the Razzie for Catwoman.
Or Sandra Bullock.
Or Sandra Bullock, yes. The same year as The Blind Side, in fact.
And literally telling them, you haven't even watched the film, so here I got the DVDs for you to watch them.
Very good. Yes. I love when these actresses just throw it right back in these nerds' face. Yeah, it just speaks to the sort of juvenile bullshit that the Razzies are culpable of, which is just like this mean-spirited sort of feeling towards especially younger actresses. It's just very infantile, sexist bullshit. That's what it is. Fritz also asked, Natalie Wood was only 25. Why no more nominations for her? So we sort of mentioned that on the other question. Maybe she wasn't the most universally acclaimed type of actress, as we see there from the Harvard Lampoon. Maybe the roles weren't as strong. I do think she tried, Inside Daisy Clover was a big swing. Unfortunately for me, it was a swing and a miss there. But yeah, I just don't know if any of her subsequent roles were quite on that level. Jeffrey Kerr said, as this year marked Natalie Wood's final Oscar nomination, what roles post-1981 do you think she could have played had it not been for her premature death?
This is a difficult question because, I mean, if she was still alive today, she would be in her 80s. Mm-hmm. And if you look at actresses who are in their 80s today or would be in their 80s if they're still with us, they didn't have that great careers in the 80s and 90s and since. I mean, Maggie Smith and Judi Dench are the exceptions here, but I don't see Natalie Wood having this type of career that Maggie Smith and Judi Dench have. And Susanna York, Faye Dunaway, Kim Novak, Louise Fletcher, Sally Kellerman. These are all actresses in a general age range. They don't really have great movie roles. I could maybe on TV, like Jessica Walter or maybe Ryan Murphy would have found
Oh
something for
God.
her.
Yeah.
I mean, but it's rather sad that women of her generation didn't have that many great roles once they were in her 50s or older.
Yeah, I think she would have struggled to find roles that she got in her prime like this. Just to think of other possibilities, I'm just, looking at some of the other like Oscar nominees, those performances of the 80s and everything. She's probably too old at this point for this, but I could have seen her in a Deborah Winger type of mold for something like Terms of Endearment or like Officer and a Gentleman. I think she could do a kind of role like that, even though she's like in her 40s and everything. One that I thought of that would be interesting is the Sigourney Weaver role in Working Girl. I don't know why. Just thought that would be fun to see her in that kind of like boss bitch kind of role.
That's a good one.
Yeah. I could have seen her like taking on like a Woody Allen film or two, maybe. So something like that. But yeah, I think would be more limited than, unfortunately, she deserved. Maury Ritchie said, would Bette Davis have won for Whatever Happened to Baby Jane if she were nominated this year?
Maybe.
I'm just going to say yes. Honestly, I think most of the nominees from last year could have won this year.
Probably, yeah.
So, make of that what you will. Cinema Sex Kitten said, the obvious omission is Elizabeth Taylor. Why do you think she missed on a nomination? On a personal note, are you a little glad you didn't have to watch the 251 minutes of Cleopatra? Oh my God, yes. Saved me a lot of time.
To answer the second question first, I haven't seen Cleopatra in more than 20 years, and I almost morbidly feel like having another look at it again. So it would have given me an excuse, and I'm not entirely sure that at some point in the next year or two, I'm actually at least starting it. Not having to watch it gives me the liberty to stop at any time. So this is an advantage. Now, why Elizabeth Taylor wasn't there? I think Elizabeth Taylor is a special case with the Academy because you probably need for her more than for anyone else, at least for anyone else who had this many brushes with the Academy, have a look at her private life and how her private life influenced maybe her awards success. Like both in the way of winning an Oscar at the point when she got sympathy votes and also being punished for doing things that are seen as scandalous, that maybe the Academy would rather not vote for her. And I think maybe at this point in her private life, she was again at the point where the Academy and the Hedda Hoppers of this world were more in the mode that they rather would not see her on the stage or not give her any opportunities to shine. So maybe this year it was the private life that really prevented her from getting a nomination.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's too much personal drama there. They'd already given her an Oscar. I think she's pretty good in Cleopatra, actually. But yeah, ultimately, I'm glad I didn't have to go through another 4-hour sitting of Cleopatra. Let's just say that. Fritz said, are there any great performances this year that were completely off the Academy's radar, but that you wish would have been considered? I mean, you mentioned there Margaret Rutherford,
Margaret Rutherford in Murder at the Gallup. I like to mention it again.
Yeah, bears repeating. We did have, I know this is also a performance that other people really liked, Julie Harris in The Haunting, which is also something that never really would have been on the radar because it's a horror performance, but yeah, Audrey Hepburn and Charade, obviously. There were options, but yeah.
I think Cleo from 5 to 7 was Oscar eligible that year, and Corinne Marchand in that film would have been another very good nomination.
Thank you for reminding me of that. Yes, completely agree. One of my favorites of this year, of this very strange and not so great year. Yes. Andrew Carden said, would Lilia Scala have made the cut with a lead campaign?
I'm going to say yes.
So that's for Lilies of the Field, just for people who don't know.
The Academy clearly loved Lilies of the Field. They loved it enough to give it a Best Picture nomination. And she is in, I think, percentage-wise, she would be third. She's in more of Lilies of the Field than the actual winner, more than Rachel Roberts is in Sporting Life, and she is in more than Shirley MacLaine is in Irma la Douce. So,
wow, yeah.
I could see her get a nomination.
I could see it too. They certainly liked the film enough, winning Best Actor. And yeah, I think, in a very barren field that they would have made room for her.
And the Academy loves nuns.
They do famously love a nun, especially when they're playing tennis. Moving on, Thomas Durnley Davison said, considering the lineup, why wasn't Audrey Hepburn nominated for Charade?
I'm afraid that maybe she was just considered to be too light. I mean, I love her in Charade. It would have been great to have her here. If she would be here, she would probably be my winner in this lineup. But it's just not the kind of film the Academy is going for.
Yeah, we were actually talking about this in the DMs this week, as you may recall.
Yes.
They were into a very certain vibe with this lineup, and she did not fit that vibe. Cinema Sex Kitten said 1963 was the debut of the Judy Garland variety show. Which of these actresses would have been the best guest star for an episode?
I mean, obviously Shirley MacLaine.
Yeah, I was going to say it's clearly Shirley MacLaine of this group. My God.
I mean, by this point in her career, Leslie Caron said she's no longer a dancer but an actress, so it has to be Shirley.
Yeah, gotta be. Maybe Natalie Wood could be fun. I don't know how she was on talk shows or anything, but yeah, I think Shirley, she's entertaining. Dark Shaka said 8.5 and Sundays in Cybele were 2 foreign language films that got some nods and wins that year. Would you nominate any of the actresses from those pictures?
I'm not sure 8.5 has a lead actress.
I would say Anouk Aimee, would be supporting, but I really liked her.
Yes. But I really think there are a lot of women in 8.5, but I would say that they are all supporting.
Yeah.
Now, I haven't seen Sundays in Cybele in quite a long time, and I'm probably mashing it together with a ton of other French films in which a world very adult befriends a kid. And I'm also not sure if the girlfriend is prominent enough to be a lead. I'm fairly certain the girl would have been put into supporting because in that era, child actors were put into supporting. So I don't really see them making the cut here.
Yeah, I mean, to go back to what you were saying, Corinne Marchand from Cleo from 5 to 7 would be my person of any foreign language film to get nominations. So, yes, all right. Well, we're out of questions. So it's time for our final segment where we discuss who we think was the runner-up of this Best Actress race. Christof, what is your verdict?
I think it's almost impossible to tell who the runner-up is that year, and
yeah, much like in Best Picture.
Yeah, and I think weirdly enough, I find myself leaning most to the one performance that you said was least likely a few minutes ago, and that's Shirley MacLaine, because on the one hand, Shirley MacLaine is something completely different than anyone else. She has won the Golden Globe, so she has been in mind, and she has been on a bit of a streak, and I could see a bit of remorse for her losing to Elizabeth Taylor in 1960, very much helping her. So I could see a way that Shirley MacLaine could have come close here. But actually, I could make a case for pretty much all of them, I must be honest, to come very close. But I tentatively would go to Shirley MacLaine here.
Yeah, and I mean, to be clear, I don't think it was impossible that it was her. I just feel like it was possibly so lightweight in general that maybe it wouldn't have been considered. But again, it could have been just she's so different from what everyone else is doing, and she's so established and well-liked at this time, and people felt she was maybe robbed of the Apartment Oscar. So yeah, that's very much a possibility. I think for me, it is Leslie Caron, if only because she has the most substantial role in terms of screen time and screen presence. You know, she won those other precursor awards. I think, you know, Natalie Wood certainly was well liked as well at the time. Shirley MacLaine, again, yeah. Rachel Roberts, I think, had also a decent amount of respect. So it really could have been anyone, but I just think maybe because going back to the New York Film Critics that really sort of kicked off this whole thing, the fact that Leslie Caron was the only other actress of all of the possibilities to vote for in Best Actress, she was the only other one who got votes, then I'm just going to say that it was her.
I'm just not convinced that the Academy would really go for her, considering the Academy has been fairly cold on her previously and not even nominated her for films that they clearly loved. But maybe just seeing her doing something very different would have been enough in a year like that.
Yeah, that's kind of also my thing too, is that the surprise factor of like, oh, I didn't know she was capable of that, might have swayed a few people to her side possibly. But yeah, who really knows here? I would love to see the vote totals here, honestly. But of course, my other question for you, what would you have voted for from this lineup? Who's your pick?
My favorite from this lineup is quite clearly Rachel Roberts. I could see myself back in the day maybe being swayed by the argument I just made and check off Shirley MacLaine's box. But in hindsight, looking at today and knowing that Shirley MacLaine has an Oscar and I can just freely pick for my favorite out of this lineup, it's Rachel Roberts for me.
Yeah, I mean, for a long time, obviously, I didn't have context for any of these others. I couldn't really imagine picking someone outside of Patricia Neal. But in watching the performances one after another, like I did this week, Rachel Roberts is the one that really rose to the top for me and really surprised me in a genuine way. And it's odd for me because I feel like the two best performances here are the ones with the least amount of screen time, that had the quote-unquote least to do compared to the others. But they both did so much with what they had. And Rachel Roberts, I can just picture so many specific images and looks that she gives in this film, and line readings even, that will probably haunt me for a while, or at least I will remember them strongly. And yeah, I would have voted for Rachel Roberts. We agree on that one, at least.
One thing.
Yes.
Well, we agreed a few more times.
Yeah, we did. Christof, thank you so much for joining me this week. This was a very fun one. I really appreciate you taking one for the team, I guess you could say, in terms of doing a year that not a lot of people necessarily requested or would have wanted to do. But I knew that I could count on you to give this as much passion and, you know, research and everything that you would for any other year. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much for having me. I really genuinely a joy for me to be here, and I was so pleasantly surprised to be invited to the main show, because I'm really just a loyal listener who has never written a word on film professionally, just a guy who loves watching movies, and so I feel very honored to be allowed to be here on the main show with you.
Well, I certainly respect your opinions on film and your dedication and everything, and your Sporcle quizzes and your curation there. So tell the fine people where they could find more of you on the internet.
Well, you can find me on Twitter at Judge Roy Snyder. I'm Christof on Letterboxd, and you can find me on Sporcle, as Kevin just mentioned, where I'm your curator for the actor and German subcategories, currently releasing a series of quizzes about films nominated at the Oscars for Best Picture, Best International Film, and Best Animated Feature, one every week. So that's how you can find me.
Very good. And thank you all so much for listening. You can find me on Twitter at Kevin_Jacobson. The show's at Oscar Runner Up. Instagram and the Runner Up is. Rate, review, and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you liked what you heard and want to hear more, go to patreon.com/andtherunnerup is, where you can hear a whole bunch of bonus episodes, including a few with Christof here. Next week, we will be delving into the 1964 Best Actress lineup, where the nominees were Julie Andrews in Mary Poppins, Anne Bancroft in The Pumpkin Eater, Sophia Loren in Marriage, Italian Style, Debbie Reynolds in The Unsinkable Molly Brown, and Kim Stanley in Seance on a Wet Afternoon, with the winner being Julie Andrews. So that's what to watch before next week. Thanks again, Christof.
Thank you. Goodbye.
And with that, I will bid you all adieu.